morning, everybody. It's so great seeing you all this morning. I hope you guys are having a great day because I know my morning has been certainly pretty fantastic. I love sitting, thank you. I love sitting and listening to all of you all worship. It's all praising the Lord together. It's fantastic. It's beautiful. And so I'm thoroughly blessed by that every time. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the Old Testament, and the topic of today's sermon is that of monuments and memorials, right? Monuments and memories. And as a society, as a culture, monuments are a big deal. You can learn a lot about a culture, about a society, by the monuments that they set up. You can learn what's important to them, who the people in their history were that were significant. In a sense, those monuments help us remember our past and help ground us in where we've come from so that we can move forward into where we're going with a sense of purpose and direction. Monuments are important. All you have to do is go to our nation's capital and see that it's full of a bunch of monuments. Monuments to presidents and leaders, monuments to the wars that we fought, and the price that was paid to give us the freedom that we have. One of the most significant monuments I've had the privilege of going to in my life has been the war memorial on the beaches of Normandy. When I was a junior in high school, in our history class, we were learning about World War II, and we learned all about Normandy and the D-Day invasion. How at that time, Europe was under Nazi occupation, right? You had Germany and France that were under Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, and then you had Mussolini and his fascist Italian regime in Italy, and Franco and his fascist regime in Spain. And so all of Europe at that point was hostile to democracy. It was under Hitler's sort of dominion. And so Britain and America, the Allied forces, they launched an attack onto northern France, the beaches of Normandy, to establish a beachhead there. And their purpose was to get a foothold onto the European continent, and from there they would be able to get people and equipment and supplies that they could take over the rest of Europe. And so through this concerted effort of planning and the incredible bravery of the men who fought on those beaches, they were able to establish a beachhead. But thousands died to make that happen. And so you're walking through this memorial on Normandy Beach. You walk along the beach, and then the path curves you through the cemetery up to the memorial for those who died so that Europe could be free, so that we could bring a downfall to Hitler and his Nazi regime. That beachhead was the beginning of the end of that war. Right? After they were able to set up, they were able to push into the rest of Europe and push back the evil forces that were at play there. And so it was worth memorializing, right? We put a monument up there so that people would see and would remember the sacrifice, and that it was something worth remembering. Well, today we're going to see how Israel set up a monument to their own version of D-Day. Our story today takes place in Joshua chapter 3, and we're going to be taking a look, just like the Allied forces invaded northern France at the beginning of their war, we're going to be taking a look at how Israel entered over the Jordan River into the land of Canaan to take over that country for themselves. It was the land that God had promised them. So as you turn to Joshua chapter 3, we're going to be in chapter 3 and 4. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on what was happening at this point. You see, for the last 40 years, under Moses, God had pulled the Israelites out of Egypt and had led them for 40 years in the desert. But the promise was, after the 40 years of wandering, God would give them the promised land. The land that he had promised to Abraham, the land that he had promised to Isaac, the land that he had promised to Jacob and to the people of Israel, right? That promise was about to come true. Moses had passed right before they were able to enter into the promised land, but now Joshua was in charge. And at the beginning of the book of Joshua, God comes to Joshua and he says, hey, you are the leader of this nation. You are the person I've chosen to lead this nation as we take over the promised land, right? Your battle orders are clear. We're going to go in to the land of Canaan. We're going to go into this land that I have promised to you, and we are going to take it for Israel. I'm going to make good on my promise to you. And so Joshua, in chapter 2, he sends out the spies and he gets the information about the first domino to fall. Jericho is going to be the first city that they attack. And so he gets his information on Jericho, and the spies come back and they share with him that the people in Jericho are terrified of Israel. That God is already setting the way, paving the way for them to take over this promised land. And so hearing that, Joshua readies the troops. He marches them towards the Jordan River, right? The Jordan River was this barrier. It was this river that signified the beginning of the promised land. Everything west of the Jordan River was promised to the people of Israel. And so they marched towards the Jordan River, towards the boundary to the promised land, the first big hurdle that they would have to overcome. And as they camped out by the river, Joshua gave the people his first orders. He said, get ready. Take 3 days to consecrate yourselves, right? Make yourselves ritually clean. Get yourself ready, both in mind and in spirit and in body, right? Get ready for the war that's about to take place. Get ready for the struggle that's about to come. Be ready and keep a lookout for the Ark of the Covenant. Keep a lookout for the Ark of the Covenant, because when the Ark of the Covenant begins to move, when the Levites start taking the Ark of the Covenant out towards the Jordan River, that's your signal that it's time to go. So be on the lookout. Follow the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was this big golden box where they kept the Ten Commandments, they kept the staff of Aaron, they kept a jar of manna, and they kept various other things that were significant that symbolized God's covenant relationship with Israel, God's faithfulness towards Israel in the past, and God's faithfulness to Israel in the future, right? It was a symbol of God's relationship with the nation of Israel. And not only that, but it was God's throne on earth, right? There was these two angels that were perched on top of they're golden statues of angels that are perched on top of the Ark of the Covenant. And we read in the Bible that in between the wings of the angels, that's where God dwelled. That's where he was. It was in the Holy of Holies. He would sit on his throne on the Ark of the Covenant, his seat. And so when the Ark of the Covenant went out, that was God heading out in front of the troops of Israel, right? They looked to the Ark of the Covenant, and it was a symbol that God was the one who was leading them. They would follow the ark. They followed the Lord, and he would go ahead of them and prepare their paths. And so Joshua said, prepare yourselves, but keep a lookout for the Ark of the Covenant. When it moves, get ready to go. And as they are taking their 3 days to get ready, the Lord speaks to Joshua. And so we're going to start in Joshua chapter 3, starting in verse 7. We read, "The Lord spoke to Joshua, 'Today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so they will know that I will be with you just as I was with Moses. Command the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the water, stand in the Jordan.' And then Joshua told all the Israelites, 'Come closer and listen to the words of the Lord, your God.' He said, 'You will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly dispossess before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, Jebusites. When the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of the whole earth goes ahead of you into the Jordan. Now choose 12 men from among the tribes of Israel, 1 man for each tribe, and when the feet of the priests who carry the Ark of the Lord of the whole earth, come to rest in the Jordan's water, its water will be cut off, and the water flowing downstream will stand up at a mass." So Joshua, he gets his commands from the Lord. The Lord says, Joshua, tell the Levites who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant to walk into the rivers of the Jordan, to go in with their feet into the river. And when that happens, I will cut off the flow of the Jordan River and I will allow for you to cross. And so Joshua, he spreads the word to the Levites and he calls the Israelites together and he says, today you will see the power of the Lord. Today, you will know when the Levites step into the water, you will know that God is with you. And as we go off into the promised land, as we go off so that God can make his promise to you complete, you will know that God goes with you when you see his power on display in the Jordan River. Right? This is my sign to you that I go with you and that I am helping you every step of the way. See, the Jordan River, we think, oh, it's a river. Right? You can swim over it. You can cross it, right? They've been crossing rivers for many, many years. How do you think people got into the land of Israel? Sometimes it's hard for us to imagine it being a big obstacle. But the problem was this was springtime, and the Jordan River was overflowing its banks. The mountains to the north had all the snow and ice from the winter melting, and it was flowing off into the Jordan River, and it was causing the Jordan to overflow its banks. The Jordan River was a rushing torrent of water at this time of year. They would have walked up to the river and they would have heard the crashing sound of waves, this rushing sound of running water, of frothing waves. And it would have been really intimidating. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever been near a rushing river, but you can hear it from far away. As they started approaching, they would have heard the of the waves. And God said, hey, I'm going to stop that. I'm going to cut it off so that you can get across and get into the land of Israel. And so sure enough, starting in verse 14, we read this. When the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant ahead of the people. Now the Jordan overflows its banks throughout the harvest season, but as soon as the priests carrying the ark reached the Jordan, their feet touched the water at its edge. And the waters flowing downstream stood still, rising up in a mass that extended as far as Adam, a city next to Zarethan. And the waters flowing downstream into the Sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. And the people crossed opposite Jericho. And the priests, carrying the Ark of the Lord's covenant, stood firmly on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground until the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan. So again, imagine the people of Israel marching up to this river that stood between them and the land of promise. And as they approach, they hear the sound of the rushing river, and this insurmountable, wide, and wild river stands between them and the promised land. And sure enough, the Ark of the Covenant is marching in front of the people of Israel, available for everybody to see. Everybody has their eyes glued to the Levites and to the Ark of the Covenant. And sure enough, they head forward and they set foot. They step into the brown, churning waters of the Jordan River. And all of a sudden, the sound of the rushing water begins to quiet down. It stops flowing quite as violently and as heavily. And the water begins to flow off. And the water level begins to dip and sink and ebb away as the water flows into the Black Sea. And all of a sudden, after just a little while, the riverbank in front of them is completely exposed and dry. And to the right of them, where the water was coming from, there would have been a wall of cascading water pinned in place by the power of God himself. And there in the middle of the riverbed are the Levites holding the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant itself, the power of God holding back the waves. And so the people of Israel, they begin to cross. And to their surprise, they discover, wait, this isn't mushy, soggy, wet soil. This is dry. This is dry land. And they begin to walk across on dry land. I love that detail. I love how like above and over and beyond God goes in this whole thing. Like it would have been totally like feasible, right? It would have been totally enough if God had just been like, all right, I'm gonna cut off the river and you guys can walk across, and yeah, you'll have to deal with some muddy, wet sand, but like I cut off the Jordan River. Like this is pretty great. But he went that extra step. He went above and beyond and said, look, I'm not just going to cut off the Jordan River. I'm going to dry off the ground that you're walking on so that it's a comfortable walk and to show my power. Not only that, but the city of Adam, right, the account tells us the water backs up all the way to the city of Adam. And so the city of Adam, it was 16 miles out from the place where they crossed. It was a 16-mile long strip of land that they crossed, and the whole nation of Israel marching across. And can you imagine standing on the walls of Jericho, watching out over the Jordan River as all of a sudden this natural barrier you were relying on to defend you against the oncoming horde is cut off just like that, and you see the entire nation of Israel, thousands of people pouring over this dry riverbed towards you. These guys would have been shaking in their boots. And there in the middle of it, the Ark of the Covenant stands, holding fast over the people of Israel. So after everybody had crossed and they started to gather on the other side of the riverbed, God gives some more orders to Joshua. We read in chapter 4, verse 1. After the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua, choose 12 men from the people, 1 man for each tribe, and command them, take 12 stones from the place in the middle of the Jordan where the priests are standing, carry them with you, and set them down at the place where you spend the night. So Joshua summoned the 12 men he had selected from the Israelites, 1 man for each tribe, and he said to them, go across to the ark of the Lord, your God, in the middle of the Jordan. Each of you lift a stone onto his shoulder, 1 for each of the Israelite tribes, so that this will be a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? You should tell them, the water of the Jordan was cut off in front of the ark of the Lord's covenant. And when it crossed the Jordan's water was cut off. Therefore, these stones will always be a memorial for the Israelites. So, after everybody had crossed to the other side, Joshua, who had chosen for himself 12 men, 1 from every tribe, calls the people together. And in accordance with God's command, he says, guys, head over to the ark, to the dry riverbed, and pick up 12 boulders and lift them over to the other side. And so these 12 guys, that probably would have been big, strong dudes, roll over to the Ark of the Covenant, and they pick up these 12 big stones. It said they had to heft them onto their shoulder, these big, giant rocks. And they carry them back over to the other side. And while they're doing that, Joshua is himself setting up a tower of rocks of his own in the middle of the riverbed, as a reminder to him and to the nation of Israel that there in the middle of the riverbed, God allowed them to cross it. He set this pile of rocks right there where the Ark of the Covenant stood, as a signal that, hey, that's where God stood when he parted the waters of the Jordan. So that everything is done according to God's commands. They carry over the rocks, and the people of Israel cross over. And when they are all standing there on the other side, rocks in hand, God says again to Joshua. The Lord told Joshua, this time in 4 verse 15, the Lord said to Joshua, command the priests who carry the ark of the testimony to come up from the Jordan. So Joshua commanded the priests to come up from the Jordan. And when the priests carrying the ark of the Lord's covenant came up from the middle of the Jordan, and their feet stepped out on solid ground, the water of the Jordan resumed its course, flowing over all the banks as before. So again, Joshua calls the people, calls the Ark of the Covenant, the Levites out of the riverbank. And as soon as they set foot on the other shore of the Jordan River, the water begins flowing again. And I don't know if you guys have ever witnessed, in one of those arroyos that we have down here, those dried riverbeds we have, when it starts raining in the mountains, if you've ever seen the water come flowing down. It's a powerful thing to see. It's like a wall of water just down this riverbed. And that's what it would have been like for the people of Israel, right? This water had been dammed up, that had been held up in a wall to their right. It was let go, and this wall of water just came cascading down behind the Levites. And with that, the exit, there was no going back. The exit that they had was cut off. The Jordan was at their back. Jericho was at their front. The only way through was forward and with the help of God. And so they go and they march on into the promised land, and they camp out at Gilgal. And there, Joshua gives a speech to the people of Israel. In verse 19, we read, "The people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month of the first month, and camped at Gilgal on the eastern limits of Jericho. And when Joshua set up in Gilgal the 12 stones that they had taken from the Jordan, and he said to the Israelites, 'In the future, when your children ask their fathers, what is the meaning of these stones, you should tell your children, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the water of the Jordan before you until you had crossed over it, just as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us, so that until we had crossed over. This is so that all the people of the earth may know that the Lord's hand is mighty, and so that you may always fear the Lord your God.'" So they set up these stones. And a fun fact about the city of Gilgal is it's Old Hebrew for circle. And so there in Gilgal, they probably would have set up these big stones in a circle, a monument to God's power and faithfulness. And there, in view of this big monument to the Lord, Joshua makes this speech. He says, "Let this be a reminder. Let this be a memory for you. That when your children ask you, what do those stones mean? What significance do they have? You can say, this is a reminder that God took us over the Jordan River on dry land. Not only that, but he took us over the Red Sea on dry land too. And let me tell you about how he took us through the desert and faithfully provided for us every step of the way. Let this be a reminder of God's glory, of God's faithfulness, and of God's provision for his people, so that you may know that the Lord is great and that you may fear the Lord. Not just you, but all nations may know." And so there, they camped, the Jordan River to their back, and the fortified city of Jericho to their front. And I guarantee some of those Israelites would have been maybe just a little bit nervous looking up at the big fortified city of Jericho, defended to the nines. But every time that they worried, they were able to look back at the circle of rocks and be reminded of God's faithfulness to them in the past and how he would be faithful to them in the future. So, in the same way, my challenge to you guys this morning is, I want you guys to take some time this week to remember God's faithfulness in the past. We all have moments like this. Maybe not as big or as flashy, but we all have moments where God has come through for us in a very tangible way. Moments of need where God has provided. Moments of sorrow and despair where God has comforted. Moments of worry and concern where God has protected us. We all have moments in our life where we have seen the fingerprints of God on display for not only us, but for the world to see. So this week, I want, just like the Israelites did, and they set up a memorial, I want you to go home this week and start writing down the ways that God has been faithful in your life. And remember, just We remember those things for three reasons. Right? I want you to do this for three reasons. The first is we set up reminders so that we can teach from the past. Right? That was Joshua's command. He says, when your children ask, you can tell them. So when you see friends, when you see your kids, when you see your family members, when you see coworkers struggling with something similar, we can look to the past and say, hey, I've been in a situation that's similar, and here's how the Lord has provided. He is faithful to me back then. He can be faithful for you today. Let me teach you from the past. Right? It can be a reminder and a teacher to those around you who ask about it. The second reason we set up reminders is we set up reminders to give us assurance in the present. Right? Just as the Israelites were probably worried about this upcoming war that they were about to wage against the people of Canaan, they could look to the crossing of the Jordan River and the faithfulness of God up until that point to give them strength in the current difficulty. And so if you find yourself here this morning and you're worried, you've had a hard time sleeping because there's something weighing heavy on your mind, there's nothing better than counting the sheep of God's blessings, his faithfulness in your past, to assuage some of that fear and nervousness. If God has been faithful in the past, he is certainly going to be faithful in the present. And then the final thing is we set up reminders so that we can walk boldly into the future. Right? If God has been faithful in the past, if he continues to be faithful in the present, he will be even more so faithful in the future. And so we can walk forward boldly and with confidence, knowing that wherever we go, God goes with us and he's got our back. If God has been faithful yesterday and he is faithful today, he will be faithful tomorrow. And those reminders in the past help us remember that, so that we could go forward boldly and do amazing things for the Lord, knowing that we don't have to hold back because God has got our back. And so, again, my challenge to you, and this is maybe going to be a little bit out there, right? After you're done writing down the various stories of God's faithfulness, write it down in a prayer journal, on a piece of paper, heck, write it down on a sticky note. Those stories, take some time to think about those, remember those, write those down. And then I want you to set up a memorial, a monument to God's faithfulness. It doesn't have to be fancy. It could be something as simple as taking that sticky note that you wrote the story on and slapping that bad boy on your mirror, so that every morning when you get ready and you're brushing your teeth, you can see that story and be reminded of God's faithfulness in the past, and how he is faithful today and how he'll be faithful in the future. When I moved down here about 5 years ago, I also discovered that you guys in Tucson love to paint rocks. That there's this tradition out here of painting rocks and doing artwork on rocks. It could be something as simple as setting up a memorial of painting a rock. It doesn't have to be fancy. You could just paint it in one color. You could paint it blue, and then maybe write a verse on there. Take a moment to maybe write a date that's significant to you. Maybe the date that the Lord came and saved you. The day that you trusted the Lord with your sins and that he came into your life and made this amazing change for relationship. Just a little memorial. It could be something as simple as tying a story of God's faithfulness to a piece of jewelry that you wear every day, a watch, a ring, a necklace. And every time you put it on, you're reminded of God's faithfulness. Don't let my suggestions be the limit. The sky is the limit. You can paint something, put something on a board. I have friends who have tattoos for that exact same reason. So that they can be reminded every time they see it. And so that when people ask about it, they can say, hey, let me tell you about my God. Right? This can be as big or as small as you want to, but I want you to set up a monument, a memorial this week to remind you of God's faithfulness. Because if God has been faithful in the past, and we remember that God's faithful in the past, it gives us hope for the future that God is faithful in the present. I meant to say present. In the present. And we know that God is faithful in the future and that he has our back no matter where we go and no matter what the world throws at us. Let's close out in prayer. Dear Lord, thank you so much for your faithfulness. Thank you so much for your provisions in the past that you provided for the Israelites, not just at the Jordan River, but consistently throughout their history. That you have provided for them even beyond that. And Lord, for the ultimate provision that you have given to us in the form of your Son. Thank you so much, Lord, for your provision. I pray that this week as we take some time to meditate on the way that you have provided for us over the years, that, Lord, we wouldn't be able to help ourselves but tell of the stories of how you have been faithful and how you have provided, that we might share with everybody that comes into our circle of your love and your goodness. Lord, I specifically want to pray as we close out for Ukraine. There's so much going on over there right now. It's such a chaotic and crazy situation. And Lord, I just want to pray for your church out there in Ukraine, that they would shine bright in the midst of this darkness, that they would be a source of peace for those who know no peace, and that they would point to the ultimate peace that can be found in you, Lord. That you would put your hand of protection there, and that you would sustain the people, the Christians, the believers who are representing you to everybody that they come across. Lord, I pray that you would protect and be working in the nation of Ukraine, especially this week. In your name I pray, Lord. Amen.